Okay, so we're going to talk about one of my favorite muscles because it's probably one of the most diverse. And it's a huge muscle that gets neglected all the time in kind of our day to day activities. This is the trapezius muscle, so it is a trap. If we're looking at it, notice that it has a massive attachment point. And so this thing spans from your lower thoracic spine, so the bottom of your rib cage, all the way up the spine to the occiput or the back of the occipital bone. So it is a long attachment point. This entire black line that I drew acts as the origin. And so there's an origin here, 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 like all along the length of the spine. This is the anchor point that we're going to be pulling to. Now, what we're pulling is the insertion point, and that is the scapula. And so notice the wings of the scapula here, these big flat bones. This muscle attaches to the top of the wing, so this part here, and then the most prominent section of the internal part of the wing. So all the way along here is the insertion point. Basically, the parts that stick out when you move. So these are all insertions. And it's okay to just say that the insertion is on the scapula. That's fine. So this is the movable bone. We're going to be moving that shoulder blade in different directions. And now we get to figure out the fun part. So which ways can this muscle move your scapula? And in this case, we have a couple of different options because look at the fibers on this thing. These fibers run from the scapula up towards the top of the head. They run from the scapula straight across, and they run from the scapula all the way down to the bottom. And so that means I have a diversity of different directions I can pull along. Remember, each of these fibers is like a piano key, and I can choose to use one of them or two of them or all of them together in a chord, and it just gives me more strength. But it also gives me a little bit of variety because I can pull in different directions. So let's look at what the trapezius can do. If we were to pull along the first fiber, if we pull the shoulder blade towards the upwards located fibers towards the head and the neck, then that's going to pull my shoulder up, right? So my shoulder elevates. If, however, I pulled the same point of the shoulder towards the midline of the thoracic spine, that's going to pull my shoulder blades together, right? So if you think of bringing your shoulder blades together, then you're retracting, you're pulling them back and together. If you are pulling your shoulder blades down towards the lowest origin or attachment point, then you're not elevating, you're pulling your shoulders down and back, and that's depression. And so the trapezius is pretty crazy in that it can do 3 actions at once along these origins because it's so wide. So it can do elevation, retraction, or depression. Now, can it do all those things at once? Not quite. It can do 2 at once. It can do retraction and depression, or it can do retraction and elevation, but we can't elevate and depress at the same time. And I think you can understand why. And if you don't, then try it. You end up stabilizing and fixating just in one place, right? So one of those fibers has to be utilized more than the other. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We can also switch up our insertions a little bit. So not only because this muscle is so super long, can we say that we have only origins along the spine, but we can say that the insertion point can also be up here on the occipital region itself, on the back of the head. And it can use an origin that is below it, usually basically level with the shoulders or lower. All of these lower origin points can be used to draw the insertion point of the back of the head down and back towards these anchor points. So it can pull down on the back of the head. And so what can it do? It can cause extension. So if your chin is tucked, it can pull on the back of your head and cause you to extend your neck. And it can even continue to pull and cause hyperextension. of the neck. Now, here's where you can go on your own to try to see if you can come up with some ideas on where you might find the antagonists to these muscles. So if the trapezius lays on the back and is involved in neck extension and hyperextension, where would we have to have a muscle on our bodies to create neck flexion? Well, if it's pulling, it probably needs to be in the front of our body. It needs to be on the anterior surface, and it's going to need to cross the neck joint. So I want you to go back to some of our muscles from before and think of where do we know some possible muscles that could fit the bill. And if we go back to our head and neck diagrams, we can see some. So there's this muscle here that is along the front of the neck, right? And that could be a possibility because it has fibers that go straight up and down. And we have this muscle here that crosses to the mastoid process and pulls down actually to the sternum. So this muscle that I'm circling here, the sternocleidomastoid, actually is layered over this one. And it would attach basically right here on the side of the body. It would come down to the sternum and then across the clavicle and back up. Right, so it's kind of a big triangle. And it can pull and create flexion down towards the central point, or it can pull laterally to create lateral flexion. And so if you're thinking that the sternocleidomastoid might be a contender as an antagonist to the trapezius, you would be right in terms of neck movement, right? The sternocleidomastoid absolutely can pull your chin down towards your sternum. So that's flexion of the head of the neck, and the trapezius can reverse that. And sure enough, when we look at our diagram, here is the sternocleidomastoid stretching towards the front, and the trapezius is right here, stretching towards the back. And so contraction and shortening of these muscles creates antagonistic movements. Notice that they share an insertion point right here on the cranium, and so that makes them a good match. Hopefully this is another helpful video for you, and if you want more examples, drop on by office hours or shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you some more problems to solve.